Hi everyone. So we're back and going to cover Chapter 5 now, Mechanisms of Disease. So you've probably noticed I've skipped a few chapters, and that's because, well, it's some great information. I don't think it's necessarily super important for you guys to learn to get the gist of this class and to keep learning your pathophysiology. So making it easy on you, you get to skip chapters 2, 3, and 4, and we're heading now to Chapter 5. So just for some basic terminology relating to diseases, first thing that you need to know is, what is health? Well, health is the physical, mental, and social well-being of somebody. Health is not merely the absence of disease. You cannot be sick and not be healthy at the same time. So health has to do with your well-being. Disease is an abnormality in the body function that happens to threaten your health. And then etiology is the study of the factors that cause a disease. So that's what is making you sick to begin with. For some more terms, idiopathic, something we actually use fairly often in the medical world. It refers to a disease of an unknown cause. So we don't know what's making you sick. The signs and symptoms, these are the objective, which are the signs, and symptoms are the subjective abnormalities that are associated with a disease. So that would be like if I take somebody's temperature and they have a fever, that's a sign. If they say, I feel hot, that's a symptom. And then the pathogenesis. The pathogenesis is the pattern of a disease's development. So that's how it's altering and changing over time and how it progresses. Diseases normally follow patterns. So epidemiology is the study of the occurrence of the disruption and the transmission of a disease. So that's how it's spread from kind of one person or using a vector, something like that. An endemic disease are ones that are native to a local disease. So that's when it's spreading like just within a specific area. And epidemics are when the disease affects a whole lot of people at the same time in the same area. So that would be like when the flu spreads and everybody gets sick. That would be an epidemic. And then patterns continue on. Besides just an epidemic, you can have a pandemic. Pandemics are widespread. They can even become global and epidemics. So that's when it's not just in that specific area. It's spread to a little more wider ranging spaces. Discovering the cause of a disease can be difficult because a lot of factors can really affect the transmission, which make it very hard to trace back sometimes. A lot of the time we don't necessarily know how it's transmitting. We might think it's from person to person, and really there's kind of a third party involved that's helping to spread it. And diseases we normally, after we can figure out how they're spread and what's causing it, our next step is how we can fight it. So we want to treat it, but besides just treating it, we also want to work on preventing it, because we want to know how can we stop it from continuing to spread and getting bigger and making more people sick. So for some mechanisms of disease, there's the genetic mechanism. And that's when genes are actually altered. So your genes alter and create abnormal proteins in your body. And proteins are sort of the building blocks of your body. So if we create abnormal proteins, that in itself can make you sick. There's also an infectious mechanism. And that's when pathogenic organisms, so like some sort of invading microbe, damages your body in some way. Neoplastic mechanism is when you have an abnormal growth of tissue. And that can actually cause physiological disturbances in your body. And then there's finally the traumatic mechanism, and that's when you actually get a physical or a chemical agent that affects the normal homeostasis of your body. If you remember back from Chapter 1, homeostasis is maintaining that constant internal environment. So a traumatic mechanism is one that's altering your ability to do that based by like a physical blunt trauma or a burn, something like that. It makes it so you can no longer maintain that constant internal environment. And then you can have metabolic mechanism. A metabolic mechanism is when there's like some malnutrition or an endocrine imbalance that makes it so that you can't take in sufficient nutrients. So diabetes is an example of that. Diabetes is an endocrine disorder, and it makes it so that your body doesn't produce insulin, which is how you metabolize glucose. And if you can't metabolize glucose, which is your body's main source of food, so then you're not taking in that nutrient. So it's a metabolic mechanism. And then you have an inflammatory mechanism. Inflammatory can be divided into a couple different categories. There's autoimmunity, which is when your own immune system is overreacting to something, and it's normally something that wouldn't necessarily create that inflammatory or immune response. Or then there's inflammation. Inflammation is your body's normal reaction to like an injury or some sort of damage in your tissue. You become inflamed because your body is trying to bring in a whole bunch of stuff to heal the specific space. So that's normal. Then another thing that can happen is over time there's degeneration. Degeneration is the breaking apart of tissues, kind of by an unknown process. We just know that it's like general wear and tear, and over time your body doesn't get as good at replacing them. So some risk factors, some predisposing conditions that are going to make you more likely to get sick or get one of those different types of mechanisms that are altering your ability to maintain homeostasis. So there are genetic factors. So that would be like genetically transmitted like disorders, things that are passed on from generation to generation. Age, if you remember from chapter 1, we talked about how the older you are, the less able you are to maintain your own internal environment. So your ability to maintain homeostasis decreases. Lifestyle. If you eat a really poor diet, you're putting yourself at risk. If you take do a lot of risky activities, you might be exposing yourself to the possibility of having a traumatic injury. Your stress level. It's a pretty common one these days. We're all very stressed, going to school and working and balancing families and, the economy and everything else. We're all really stressed all the time. Well, that stress level releases certain hormones and steroids in your body that actually make it less likely to heal and take care of itself. Environmental factors, so that could be things that you're exposed to in the environment, like getting exposed to being sick, or if you're in a really, in an environment where there's bad air or a lot of pollution, just stuff like that might predispose you as well. Or a pre-existing condition. So if I already have diabetes, let's say, I'm at risk for developing a lot of other things that are just complications from having diabetes. So now that we've talked a little bit about some terminology and some risk factors, so if you remember, one of them was an infectious mechanism. An infectious mechanism is something that's an organism or a particle. Like I said, it's a microbe. There are a bunch of different classifications or categories of these. The first one would be viruses. So viruses are microscopic. They are just these little intracellular parasites that consist of a nucleic acid core with a protein coat. No, I don't expect you to know that. I just expect you to know that there are viruses. And what viruses do are that they invade their host cell, and they're going to kind of invade the DNA of your host cell and insert their own DNA so that it kind of keeps reproducing that damaged cell instead of the good cell, because it's inserting their own DNA into what would normally be replicated from your cell. And then viruses are classified by their shape, the type of nucleic acid, and how they reproduce. So that's a couple of pictures of them. You can see here in the middle, there's the different types of the DNA that it's changing in all these different viruses, and they're teeny. If you look here, that's 0.5 microns, which, let me tell you, is super, super microscopic. So those are just some examples. So types of organisms, another one would be a prion. Prion is a pathogenic protein molecule. So it converts a normal protein to an abnormal protein in you. And then it causes abnormal functions to happen, because if your protein isn't normal, it's not going to do its normal job. The other thing with this is that it can actually be passed on to the next generation. So your offspring might get that same abnormal protein. And these can cause rare degenerative disorders of your nervous system. Like one of them is mad cow disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. So that would be an example of a prion. And that would be what a prion looks like. You can see it's just kind of that long chain there, and that's because this chain is actually made up of a whole bunch of proteins linked together. So it's causing some sort of abnormality in that chain. So the next one, this one's very, very common in our world, is bacteria. So bacteria are tiny cells. They do not have a nuclei, which makes them different from a virus. And they secrete various toxins that are released into the host cell. And they form these little colonies to disrupt normal function. And they get classified into two different categories. There's aerobic. Aerobic on anything means that it requires oxygen. And anaerobic. Anaerobic means that it does not require oxygen. And those are universal terms, so anytime you see aerobic or anaerobic, it always means with or without oxygen. But bacteria is one of the things we use that on a lot to classify them. And then they can also be classified by staining them. So if I take a blood sample from someone to try to see if they have sepsis meaning that they have a bacteria in their blood, and I kind of lay out a film on a slide, I would actually put some dye on there. And then I would look to see if it was gram-positive or gram-negative. So that means, do they take the dye or do they not? It's just a different way of classifying them. And that just lets us know what their what the membrane around them is, and it helps us decide how we're going to treat them, because if the dye gets in, it kind of lets us know that one certain course of treatment would be effective, and if the dye doesn't, it tells us that that course of treatment wouldn't be effective. We need a different way to treat it. And then bacteria are also classified by different shapes. So they can be rod-shaped or round or curved or spiral. And you don't need to know that. I just want you to know that there are some different ways to classify them, and just to kind of be familiar with the terms, because you will probably see them somewhere in the medical field. Normally see, like, lab results were drawn and was found to have gram-positive cocci. So if I know if it says gram-positive cocci, it means that it was a bacteria cell, even though it doesn't say that. I know it was a bacteria cell, that the membrane took up the dye, and that it was round in shape, which means a lot to the people who are deciding which antibiotic that they're going to give the patient. So the other interesting thing about bacteria is that it forms spores. Spores are non-reproducing forms of the bacteria that are very, very resistant to unfavorable environmental conditions. So it's sort of like when it's unfavorable, the bacteria itself goes into these spores, which means that they're not reproducing at the time, but they're not dying either. So that they can kind of open up, and after, when the environment becomes favorable again, and they can actually reinfect. So that's a picture there, just so you know what they look like. So then, now we've done viruses, prions, and bacteria. We'll cover fungi. So fungi are very simple organisms, similar to plants, but they lack that chlorophyll, the green pigment in plants. And they can also be divided into a couple of different sections. Yeast is very common, something that we actually use fairly regularly in our diet. We put yeast to make bread and to make things rise, and that's because the fermentation that it does makes things rise, or makes beer ferment, that kind of stuff. Or mold. Mold is a larger molecule. And they can have mycotic infections, which is when they're resistant to treatment. So yeasts are normally what we see people getting. Can get yeast infections in the genital area or on your tongue or in any warm, moist environment. A lot of the time people can get them in skin folds or things like that. That's spores. I think I have a picture somewhere further down of thrush, which is actually a really really common tongue yeast. So there's some pictures that it's actually some yeast and some mold spores there. And then we have protozoa. Protozoa are large one-cell organisms that have an organized nuclei. So these are more like parasite kind of things. And they infest human fluids. They parasitize or they destroy the cells where they are. A couple of major groups of these. Like I kind of said before, I don't really expect you to know the major groups. I just kind of want you to be familiar with some of the terms. But I'm not going to test you on any of these specific things. I really just want you to know that these are some of the classifications so that if you ever see them in the future, you can kind of be like, oh yeah, I heard that once. Those are some pictures of some protozoa. And then finally we have large, complex, multicellular organisms, which are pathogenic animals. So these are like bigger things that can damage your human tissue. So that would be like internal parasites, like ones that like strongyles or heartworms. If anybody has a pet, you know how you treat your pets for heartworms. So those are like very large creatures that can actually damage your tissue. And these can be divided into a few different categories. There's like worms, and then even things like mites and ticks and fleas, stinging things. Those all fall into this category too. And one of the important things to know about this category, those arthropods there on the bottom, are that these often work as vectors for a disease. What that means is that they can actually pick up a disease in one animal or human and transmit it to the next one that they bite. One of the most common things with this is actually ticks. So I'm sure most people are very well aware of. Ticks can transmit Lyme disease. They work as the vector. They bite an infected animal, then kind of chain progresses, and then if they eventually bite a human, then the human can get Lyme disease. So for some mechanisms of transmission, since we were just talking about vectors, there's person-to-person contact, and that can be prevented a lot by education and just using an aseptic technique. So person-to-person contact, that means like I can carry a bacteria on my hands, and if I touch you, I might spread it to you. Or if you touch me and you have it on your hands, then you can spread it to me. Or if you cough and your sputum gets directly on me, that kind of stuff. And that's why there's a lot of push for hand washing and covering your mouth and nose when you sneeze. It's because that's minimizing that person-to-person contact transmission. Another thing is environmental contact. So that would be like I cough in my hand and I put it on the table. There might be some bacteria that are still surviving on that table, so the next person to go and touch that can pick them up. So that would be an environmental contact, and as long as you have some safe sanitation practices, it's normally not that big of an issue, but it's definitely one of those things that it's like keeping yourself clean and your environment clean. So then for other things, there's opportunistic invasions. So these can be prevented by avoiding changes in your skin and mucous membranes and like cleansing your wounds. So if you think about it, really we carry a whole lot of bacteria on our skin all the time. I mean, the world is dirty. There's a lot of bacteria in it and viruses and just all of that stuff that I talked about before. It's really everywhere in our environment, but most of the time we don't get sick. And that's because our skin really works as a fantastic defense to the outside world. It's going to really protect us from anything invading and getting inside to make us sick. But now if I cut my hand open and I don't clean it, all of that bacteria or viruses or whatever it happened to be that was on my skin can now get in. So they saw an opportunity. They found the opportunity of that break in my skin, and I can now get infected from that. And that's why they really encourage a lot of good cleansing of wounds and keeping an eye on it to make sure that it doesn't get infected. And then we have transmission by a vector. It's kind of like what I said before, how things like mosquitoes and ticks, those are vectors. And that's because they're transmitting whatever the disease or bacteria is from one creature to another. So you didn't have to have direct contact. It transmitted it for you. And this is normally prevented by reducing the population of the vectors or reducing your contact with the vectors. So, like if you put out bug traps to decrease the amount of bugs outside, and then when you go outside, you wear bug spray. So you've decreased the population with the bug traps, and you reduce your contact with it by putting bug spray on yourself. And then some other ways that we prevent, because we're all big believers in prevention normally in the medical world, are vaccination. So vaccination actually stimulates your own immunity for something to form. And that's because when you vaccinate someone, you are exposing them to either a very, very small amount of whatever the infection is or infectious body is, or a damaged amount, or a dead amount, something enough that it's going to trigger your immune system to say, oh yeah, that's bad. I need to develop antibodies against it. So your body develops a whole host of antibodies to defend itself against it. And so then the next time that it sees that same, whatever that invading body is, it recognizes it and it can destroy it. So that's what vaccinations are for. And then the other thing we use a lot are chemicals. And not chemicals in the bad way, like for the traumatic mechanism, but chemicals that are something that we create that destroy or inhibit the pathogens. So that's like antibiotics or antivirals or antifungals. It's some sort of either natural or synthetic compound that destroys whatever that pathogen is. So that really sums up all the pathogenic invasions and the infectious part. So now we're going to talk a little bit about neoplasms. So neoplasms, this is the abnormal growth of cells. So that's what just the definition of a neoplasm is. So that's when kind of like your cell no longer grows on the normal path. It either grows oddly and then normally it starts reproducing faster, and that's really where tumors come from. So your tumor can be benign, and that means it's kind of like this odd growing cluster of cells, but it's very localized. If it's malignant, that means that it's spreading. It's forming another tumor somewhere else in like that same little area. It's not just the one tumor now, it's two tumors. And then you can have a metastasis. Metastasis is when they actually leave wherever the primary tumor was, and they're starting another tumor someplace else in the body. So that would be like if I have lung cancer. First, I might just have one little tumor. It's kind of benign, it's not really doing much. And then maybe I come back again the next year for another checkup, and I have two tumors. And I come back the next year, and now not only do I have 4 tumors located in my lung, but they also find that I have it is metastasized, and now I have bone cancer too. I have tumors in my bones. So that would be kind of how that's different. So benign is just the one, malignant is when there's more than one, and then metastasis is when it's actually left that initial spot where it started, and now I have them located in other areas as well. So tumors can really be classified in a whole lot of different ways. I really just kind of want you guys to know the categories. All those little subcategories that are listed here are just to help you get an idea. So they're just because I know sometimes people need a little more information than just the basics to help them understand and remember. So you can have a benign tumor, and it can happen in a whole lot of different places. So it can be epithelial, which means those are like your skin cells, or it can be in connective tissue, but these ones are just benign tumors. So the benign means that there's only the one, it hasn't spread, it's not really going anywhere. And then you can have carcinomas, which are malignant epithelial tissues, or sarcomas, and those are the malignant connective tissue ones. And then those are some examples, like lymphoma. Your lymph tissue is a connective tissue, so lymphoma is actually a sarcoma. Where melanoma is skin is a type of epithelial tissue, so melanoma is a carcinoma. So some causes of cancer. There are really a lot of causes of cancer, and they're varied and really still not very well understood. What we know is that cancer involves the hyperplasia. Hyperplasia means that it's like too many cells are growing. And anaplasia. Anaplasia is when there's the development of undifferentiated cells. So that means that they're like not really normal and they're not clear anymore. So we're making like too many not normal cells. And that's why tumors get to be kind of like those big bulged things that we see. If you ever look at one on a CAT scan or on an x-ray or something, normally you can see them, and they look like big kind of round bulgy things. And it's because there are too many of them are growing and they're not normal. So like we said, the causes of cancer aren't necessarily super well understood. The factors that play a role in causing cancer, though, that we know of at least so far, though, that there can be genetic cancer. A lot of cancers do seem to follow some sort of genetic pathway, kind of like get passed down from one generation to another, at least in some way, shape, or form. We're not really entirely sure for the most part how that happens, if there's a specific like cancer gene, or if it makes you get cancer, or if it just predisposes you so that if you're exposed to the right things, it gives you cancer. And then another thing are carcinogens. Carcinogens are chemicals that exist in our environment. Normally, they're not natural forming chemicals or something that is man-created that alter the genetic activity of somebody. So it alters their genes so that now their cells aren't producing correctly. Age. So remember how we talked about homeostasis and how your ability to maintain it alters when you age, it decreases. So your ability to make sure that all of your cells kind of stay in line and grow correctly and grow at the right speed decreases over age as well. So your cell activity changes over time, and you can kind of accumulate those damaged cells, and the effects of them kind of add up over time. And then your environment. So the chronic exposure to those damaging substances, chronic exposure to bad air or bad food or things like that, those can all predispose you for cancer. And then viruses. So you remember how we talked about how viruses actually invade a cell and can alter its DNA. It's going to make it now start creating that virus DNA. If that really does get very well embedded, can actually cause you to have cancer, can develop cancer from it. So the pathogenesis of cancer, some of the signs of cancer. Signs of cancer really vary a lot depending on what type of cancer it is. So that's really very, very broad term to try and clear. But there are a lot of methods of detecting cancer. Some of that is self-examination. And that can be a lot of different things. I know that like women are always encouraged to do self-breast exams. And the doctors normally do a lot of type of exams when you go in to see them. But even then, for self-examination, you should always look at your skin and check to see if moles are starting to look funny. That kind of stuff. You're going to know if something's not right with your own body. And then we do a lot of diagnostic imaging, so that would be like CT scans and x-rays and MRIs and ultrasounds, that kind of stuff. Do biopsies, even your pap smear, we're taking a sample of tissue and looking at it under a microscope to see what those cells look like, and blood tests. There are, most of the time cancer alters your white blood cell production, so we can take blood tests and look at how your white blood cells are developing, and that can give us a lot of information as well. So these are just some pictures. Like I said before, a lot of the time, because tumor cells grow very rapidly and they don't grow normal, they are pretty obvious. You can see here, these are just some examples of the tumor cells. So that would be liver, kidney, that's your inferior vena cava, and that would be a big tumor cell right there. You can see how the tissue looks totally different, right? So tumors are also really divided a lot by staging and grading. So we stage tumors to classify it by size and the extent of the spread. Like, you probably heard somebody say, like, I have, stage 2 lung cancer. That really, and it does vary a lot depending on what the specific type of cancer is. But it is a way of classifying exactly how large the tumor is, and if it's just a benign tumor, or is it a malignant tumor, or has it actually metastasized. And then grading is assessing the likely pattern of the tumor's development, and that's very different based on the different type of tumor that you happen to have, or the different type of cancer. So a symptom that oftentimes goes along with having cancers is to get cachexia. Cachexia is a syndrome where someone has lost their appetite, they're losing weight, and they're generally weak. And that's because those cancer cells are growing really rapidly and they're taking up a lot of your body's resources. They normally make you just not feel good. So they make you feel very weak, and you start to lose weight, and you lose your appetite just because you're weak and exhausted. So it's hard for you to get up that energy that it actually takes to eat. That's what cachexia is. And then for causes of death by cancer, cancer itself doesn't normally kill people. It's normally some sort of secondary thing. Like it's taken up so much of their white blood cells that they die because of an infection or organ failure or hemorrhage. Something else happens because the cancer has kind of damaged and weakened their body and taken up so many of its resources. So now that we've talked about all that, so what do we do? So some treatments for cancer. A lot of the time there's surgery. We can try to remove whatever the tumor is or the organ tissue around the tumor. We'll kind of go as far as we need to feel like we're getting as much of those altered, non-normal cells out. Chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is a chemical therapy, and those are drugs that work to inhibit the growth of tissues. And the reason why, if you know anybody who's been on chemotherapy, it like they lose their hair and that kind of stuff, it's because most chemotherapy drugs are actually targeted at rapidly dividing cells, and that's because of that. That's one of the characteristics of tumor cells, is that they develop very rapidly. And so it's targeted to destroy cells that develop very rapidly, because it's a way that we can kind of single out some of those tumor cells. But it is also going to damage other cells in your body that happen to develop really rapidly, and hair is one of the things in your body that grows really fast. And then there's radiation therapy. So radiation is when we're sending those radiotherapy waves, normally directed at where the cancer cell is, to try to prevent it from continuing to grow or from coming back. And then there's laser therapy, works kind of like radiation therapy, and then immunotherapy. And then there are some new strategies that we're always kind of trying to see what's going to work and what's going to be best. Enzymes or different drugs that target specific molecules, stuff like that. Cancer is definitely something that there's always a lot of research being done on. So, enough about cancer, kind of a depressing topic. Talk a little bit about inflammation before we finish. So inflammation is definitely a part of everybody's daily life, whether you know it or not. So inflammation is just a normal response that your body has to any injury to tissue. So that could be like some sort of internal thing, like being exposed to a bacteria in a specific area, or it could be an actual physical injury. And it's your inflammatory response is supposed to reduce the injury to the actual tissue in an attempt to maintain homeostasis. So normally when there's inflammation, there's redness and heat and swelling and pain, and that's because your body's kind of trying to flush a whole bunch of resources to the area. So it's bringing a lot of blood and a lot of kind of oxygen and white blood cells and all of this stuff to the area to try to heal it. Wants to reduce the injury and try to contain it. And inflammation is triggered by a few mediators, things like histamine and prostaglandins and kinins and stuff like that, that are kind of get to that area and say, oh, something's wrong, and put up their They're red flags so that everything goes there. So it causes the blood vessels to dilate, like I said, to increase that blood flow, which is why there's redness and heat, and it's bringing the white blood cells quickly to that injured site so that it can help heal it. So that's just a picture for you. You can see where somebody gets the splinter in their skin right there. Now there's some bacteria that was introduced, remember, because this is breaking that barrier, allowing some of these opportunistic pathogens to come in. So then, now there's swelling around this. And they're swelling there because your blood vessels have all dilated to bring all those extra white blood cells to the area, to try to clean that up and take care of it and heal your body to bring it back to its normal homeostasis. So, your inflammatory response reduces injury to tissues, which maintains homeostasis. And it does that, like I said, by those inflammation mediators. And some of those are going to increase blood vessel permeability. That's what causes that swelling and pain. And the white blood cells can move easily out of the vessel to attack that bacteria and dilute that irritant. And then some actually attract the white blood cells themselves because it wants to attract those white blood cells as well as bring all of your increase the blood flow to the area in general. And the whole purpose, like we said, is to maintain homeostasis because we want to kind of deal with whatever is causing the injury or the trauma or the infection so that you can come back to your normal state. And so you can also have inflammatory diseases. So it's not always just a specific injury, like with the splinter. It can actually be a disease, and that can be localized, so one little spot, which is like an infection, or it can be systemic, which is body-wide. And some of the signs of that would be a fever. If you have an infection, normally you have a fever, and that's because the high body temperature is your body kind of resetting its own thermostat, because it's hoping that whatever the invading pathogen is can't survive at that higher temperature. So it's trying to kill off some of that bacteria for you. But besides just that, there are also some chronic inflammatory diseases. And so you can end up having some chronic issues if you have a disease that keeps triggering it. And that chronic inflammation can actually cause damage, even though it's actually trying to fix it. So that was kind of a brief overview of Chapter 5. And so next you can move on to Chapter 6, the integumentary system.